All right, so I'm just going to do a rapid fire overview of FDA regulation of drugs and biologics. I'm happy to talk about devices, but there's just so much related to drugs, and we have several examples in this space that I was going to focus on that. But if there's interest in devices, then happy to answer that as a part of the questions. All right, here are my disclosures. I've received no funding from any sort of healthcare industry. Some of my affiliations were mentioned as a part of the introduction. All right. So, why as practicing clinicians should we care about the FDA? The FDA, before I got into like the research areas related to drug regulation or device regulation, seemed to be this sort of omniscient presence. When we prescribe something that's FDA approved for our patients, there's an assumption that due diligence has been done in terms of looking at the safety and efficacy of that product, and we have assurance that we provide something to our patients that we know that the product works and that our patients won't be harmed from it. And so it plays very much a background role in terms of our clinical practice, but obviously a very important role given kind of the deference that we give to the agency in terms of taking on the scientific and clinical review of these products and providing us that sort of reassurance that we prescribe things to our patients that we know that it works. And our patients, when they see FDA approved as well, also have this assumption as well, that products that are FDA approved have that rubber stamp, that kind of gold standard of review of safety and efficacy, and that we know that the products are going to be effective and safe for them. And FDA's footprint goes beyond just individual patients or clinicians, but really to our economy and also just our healthcare system writ large. I think the numbers are kind of debatable here, but roughly about 20 to 25% of our economy, or every dollar that's spent, is regulated by the FDA. So remember, it's food, drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, supplements. FDA regulates a whole slew of products that are available for us, both through prescriptions but also in the outpatient or the over-the-counter market. And nearly 70% of every outpatient visit involves some sort of medication therapy, so not even just devices, just meds alone. And nearly 80% of every hospital ER visit also involves some sort of medication therapy. These numbers are a little bit outdated, and I was looking at some figures last night, but they're roughly on par right now. But the percent of people using around one prescription drug over the last month, according to the CDC, is around 50%. And the percentage of folks who use 3 or more prescription drugs over the past month is around 25%, or about a quarter. And the percent of people using 5 or more prescription medications, so what we consider to be polypharmacy, is around 13%. So a significant amount of influence in terms of how we even practice medicine just on drugs alone. FDA's focus has changed over time. So initially, when the Food and Drug Administration was set up in the 1930s, there was just a focus initially on safety. So before this, folks could kind of sell anything that was concocted in their kitchens or in their bathtubs and market it as a product that would work across certain conditions. And there was no regulation in terms of making sure that this would not harm patients. And so that changed in the 1930s under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act after a series of concerns around harms that were actually occurring to patients at the time. And then later on in the 1960s, after the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, and I'm going over this very, very broadly, there was also an additional mandate for FDA to look at efficacy. And this happened in the wake of the thalidomide scandal that was occurring mostly in other countries, where we had actually an FDA medical officer here in the United States who actually saw that not only were there like safety sort of concerns, but also questions related to efficacy as well. Then after that, we've also seen kind of a shift from safety and efficacy towards speed. So the idea of not only ensuring that we have good review of products, but also for what we call diseases of unmet need, or diseases in which there were no other options available, offering alternative pathways for regulatory review. And this initially started off with the Orphan Drug Act, so for rare diseases, and rare diseases in the US is defined as usually 200,000 patients that are afflicted by the disease or less within the US population, or where there's a serious disease where there's no other alternatives available. That there was a series of incentives that were put into place, both in terms of research and development, but also in terms of regulatory review to kind of hasten FDA's approval system or approval process for these products. And then later on, we also had this for other products, including generics, which Ravi will talk about under the Hatch-Waxman Act, as well as other pathways, including accelerated approval. And I'll go into more detail as we go on. Then we have a series of sort of other bills that also prioritize speed, this idea of timely access to new products. in addition to looking at safety and efficacy. And we'll talk about kind of the balance that FDA's had to play across these three different sort of mandates around safety, efficacy, and speed, and how that's shifted over the years. So what does the FDA do? So the FDA approves drugs, devices, and other sorts of medical products, and they determine that they're safe and effective for conditional use prescribed or suggested within the drug label. And that what that means is that there would be a specified indication. So when something is FDA approved, it's for a specific disease and sometimes a stage of disease. So folks might have seen the Alzheimer's disease drugs that were approved in recent years. The indication for that was a specific indication of early Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment, so not kind of Alzheimer's writ large, although we'll talk a little bit about the controversy related to that. It's also for a specified population, so on drug labels, it'll specify sometimes ages of the population, sometimes certain demographics of the population, depending on some of the approvals that we've seen in the past, or it might also specify, particular subpopulations with like genetic mutations. In cancer in particular, you oftentimes will see some drugs are indicated for a genetic mutation of a cancer as the population that's indicated for. There's also dose and duration that's also specified on the drug label that FDA approves a particular product for. So you'll see specific doses that are being tested that FDA said this dose is actually what we determined to be safe and effective for this population and this indication as well. There's a burden on sponsors, so it's up to the companies that are bringing forward these applications to actually demonstrate that the drug is safe and effective for the proposed use within the application. So the onus is on them to provide the evidence to the FDA that the FDA then reviews to determine safety and efficacy. And then FDA provides guidance, and these are non-binding recommendations to sponsors about what the regulatory review standards are or the regulatory approval standards are for these various products. This is how they define what safety measures need to be met, what substantial evidence of effectiveness needs to be met as a part of the drug application process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So just to stress the guidance, again, these are kind of broad parameters that FDA puts out. You sometimes will see with federal agencies, they put out regulations or rules, which FDA does, but FDA for medical product review, in order to have discretion, have some flexibility in terms of how they set regulatory standards, issues oftentimes guidance, which are non-binding recommendations in terms of how they might review products. And this provides kind of anticipatory guidance to sponsors about what sorts of studies that they need to conduct in order to be able to go through the regulatory review process and successfully get approval. FDA, very importantly, and this is actually a part of the many lawsuits that are happening that Chris and Matt and also Ben will talk about later today. FDA does not regulate clinical practice. So once a medical product is on the market, right, it's authorized by the FDA, clinicians are actually able to prescribe it off-label for other uses. There might be some restrictions on the coverage side. Sometimes insurance companies will not cover it for a particular indication that is off-label. But once it's on the market, clinicians can prescribe it for other uses. So we'll talk a little bit about how FDA is funded. So, FDA does receive funding from Congress through congressional appropriations. So right now we're actually in the middle of the FY 2025 appropriations fight. Some of our lobby day activities will actually be around congressional appropriations issues related to the FDA, and we'll talk about this in the upcoming days. But FDA is also funded through a mechanism called user fees. So in the 1990s, a new mechanism called user fees was set up, in which sponsors with their drug applications or their medical product applications would pay a fee as a part of their application that goes to the agencies to help fund staff to help review their products much more quickly or within a timely manner, and also to be able to provide funding for various operations related to drug approval or device approval or various other medical product approvals. Now for prescription drugs, what's actually being spent through user fees for prescription drugs is actually 75%. So a majority, and an overwhelming majority of FDA's operations related to prescription drug regulatory review processes actually come from industry funding. And what's interesting about this is that the industry actually negotiates what these user fees are used for. So every 5 years, behind closed doors, companies meet with the FDA to tell them, hey, we're going to give you X million dollars in user fees, usually a few million, with each application. In exchange for that, we actually want to make sure that these fees are being used for certain activities. So more often than not, usually things related to approval, hastening approval, expedited review programs, having more face time with the FDA when they go through the regulatory review process, and also creating new pilot programs or new programs just generally to be able to expedite approval and lower regulatory standards. And I'll talk a little bit about this. So this is how the shifts in, or the adoption of user fees has led to some shifts in terms of how FDA actually reviews FDA or drug applications. So initially what had been the standard, guideline for substantial evidence of effectiveness, like what would actually be FDA's marker for looking at if whether or not a product would work, was actually 2 or more adequate and well-controlled investigations. Typically, these are randomized controlled trials where you have a product that's being compared to a placebo or another standard of care or an active comparator, and there would be a clinical trial to see if the drug is actually superior compared to nothing at all or what's already on the market. Now that's actually shifted quite a bit. We've seen now that it's actually just 1 adequate and well-controlled investigation. That's a majority of the pivotal trials that support FDA drug approvals. So you can imagine for like science, like we do an experiment. We want to see if the experiment is not a fluke. We do it again, right, for replicability purposes to actually make sure that the results that we saw were not just because of a one-off sort of issue. Instead, now FDA allows for 1 trial being the standard of approval and also what we call confirmatory evidence. And confirmatory evidence can include in vitro studies, so studies that are done in a test tube, animal control data, for instance. It can also be what we call real-world evidence, so evidence that's actually gleaned from electronic health records or insurance claims data, and also natural history studies, kind of lower standards of evidence outside of kind of the typical gold standard of randomized controlled trials. On top of that, we've actually shifted away, increasingly so, from placebo-controlled or active comparators, so actually comparing the candidate to something else that's already in the market, to actually single-arm trials. So we're just looking at the product in a population and seeing what happens over time when people take it without actually having a comparison group. So raising questions of whether or not this is actually better than standard of care. We also have shifted from clinical endpoints, so directly measuring how patients feel, function, or survive, to surrogate markers. So the idea of blood tests or changes in imaging as being the basis of approval that are thought to reasonably predict or be associated with clinical outcomes. And there are some questions around this that I'll talk about as well. And then we've also moved from traditional approval pathways, so usually 10 months of regulatory review, where FDA looks at safety and efficacy information, to now more expedited review pathways, so things like priority review, which actually shortens the regulatory review time to 6 months, and some new pathways have even shortened it even further to 5 months, and we've done some studies to actually show that's even 3 months or 2 months, depending on the pathway as well. So we've seen a huge shift in terms of how FDA regulates products with an emphasis more on speed, and a lot of this driven by a lot of proposals that have come through companies through user fee processes, saying that their money that they're giving for their drug applications will be tied to these sorts of parameters around regulatory review standards. So these are just kind of different examples of FDA expedited review pathways. I just wanted to give you a glimpse. We have priority review, which I mentioned before, that shortens the regulatory review time from the standard 10 months to 6 months. And there's been prior studies to show that when we actually shorten regulatory review times, there's actually an increase in safety actions. So either product withdrawal, black box warnings, safety communications like Dear Doctor letters to physicians, and also changes in the label that happen over time when we actually do faster reviews. We have accelerated approval, and I'll talk a little bit about this as well because this has become kind of the pathway that has emerged across different disease areas. Traditionally had been primarily, it started off as a way to kind of expedite approval for HIV/AIDS medications, that where there wasn't enough, where there was concern that we were actually not bringing those products to market in a timely manner in the midst of an epidemic that was happening here in the United States. After accelerated approval came to be at the FDA, it got expanded to oncology drugs. So majority of accelerated approval drugs over the last 10 years are primarily for cancer drugs. And now we're seeing a shift even further to other areas like neurology, rare diseases, where accelerated approval is used. With accelerated approval, the promise that's made is that sponsors can get faster access to the market by using a surrogate marker that's reasonably likely to predict how a patient feels, functions, or survives, so not a clinical endpoint. And FDA will award early approval in exchange for the company completing an additional study after approval to confirm that there's a clinical benefit. And we've seen some issues with that in which companies have either not done their studies, have delayed doing their studies, or even when clinical benefit is not found, FDA allowing the drugs to continue to be on the market. So a lot of concerns for us as clinicians in terms of, do we know that these products work for our patients, and will we ever know if they work? And then we have other designations as well. And you can imagine something like breakthrough designation, which has a connotation of being an amazing product. When we have regulatory standards that don't match what that word actually means, a lot of confusion happening for both clinicians and patients as well. So all that to say is like, okay, we see all these sort of issues with like expedited approval. What does that mean in terms of our patients? What does that mean in terms of, are we seeing high therapeutic value for the products that are coming through these expedited approval pathways? This is a study that was done by colleagues up at Harvard, and they actually compared drugs that were approved under FDA accelerated approval versus EMA's conditional approval, another kind of analogous expedited approval pathway. What they found is that here in the US, we actually approve way more drugs under accelerated approval, and they're of lower therapeutic value compared to what we see in Europe as well. So getting things on the market faster, but are they more beneficial to our patients? A lot of questions still remaining. So just kind of level set a little bit, we see like FDA approval as kind of being one of these many innovation incentives in this space. The signal that FDA approval gives to companies, to sponsors, is that, hey, a regulatory agency that's the gold standard for the world has said our product is safe and effective. It sends a market signal to other companies, to patients, to clinicians, that our product is ready for use and should be made available. And it has huge impacts in terms of how innovation occurs, in terms of the clinical trial standards, how does study design actually occur? If FDA says like your clinical trial doesn't need to be a randomized controlled trial, that shifts how clinical R&D actually works. If FDA says you can allow for in vitro studies to be the basis of approval, that also shifts what preclinical R&D also means as well. So we look at FDA approval standards as really being a marker of innovation and really setting the landscape for what innovation looks like. And what does this mean, ultimately for patients and clinicians? We have increased uncertainty of clinical benefit at the time of approval. So it's really shifting the burden of uncertainty onto patients and clinicians at the time of approval. And it's unclear unless there is a mandatory requirement that a study is actually done and completed in a timely manner after approval, if clinical benefit may ever be known. We have uncertain treatment landscape for our patients and clinicians. We're unable to determine which treatment amongst a slew of options might be most optimal for our patients because the clinical trials are not telling us that information. And we're also seeing concerns around safety with shorter regulatory review times and approvals. And I mentioned before the downstream safety impacts that we see with these sorts of shorter review times that are occurring for once products are on the market. And also kind of put forward that this actually has a disproportionate impact on our most vulnerable patients, our older adults, patients of color because of structural racism that experience more disease as well. That when we have bad FDA approval standards or kind of lower FDA approval standards, this actually has undue health equity impacts as well. So thinking about, this is not just an innovation sort of ecosystem, but really as a health equity sort of incentive as well. If we raise FDA regulatory review standards, this actually might have disproportionately positive impacts for our most vulnerable patients as well. The ones that are taking more medications, the ones that are needing to have treatments because of disease impacts and disease burdens as well. So I'll kind of skip over this, but this is also true in the device space. This is just an example of, we've done some writing around, looking at how FDA, in their efforts to kind of improve health equity, instead of kind of awarding incentives like faster approval to get more products on the market, to actually reach out to vulnerable populations. There's been some proposals and actually some policy that has passed through FDA saying that they will actually give expedited review designations to new drugs and devices if there's a potential to address health disparities, but not making sure that the drugs actually work or if there's safety concerns being addressed in those populations. There's actually a real important impact that clinicians can actually play a role in terms of making sure that the voices of all of us in terms of what matters to us as clinicians, what matters to us as our patients in terms of making sure that safety and efficacy of these products are actually known instead of like the potential for potential efficacies actually on the market, like those sorts of things are also addressed as well. But I'm happy to send this out. It's kind of additional reading, I guess, to put in. So just stop there. That was kind of like a huge, very quick snapshot of the FDA approval landscape, and happy to answer questions or clarify anything.